There's no other industry that is able to put 80,000 people in an arena and seeing 22 actors actually playing an unscripted scenario live in front of you.
Meet Hadrien Perazzini, founder of Lake38, supporting investors, ownership groups, and rights holders with strategic advisory with a focus on value creation. A senior executive with 20-plus years of international and cross-business experience in multicultural environments in the world of sport, media, and entertainment, including Arsenal, IMG, and the NBA.
The sports industry is ultimately an aggregation of very complex and entrenched ecosystem. I think we have professionalized the expectations. We haven't yet professionalized always the execution. I think there's still a big gap there. There needs to be a long-term value creation approach. Quick flips don't work. Come in with that. Avoid paying passion premium.
What structural change do you think would have reshaped the sport investment landscape the most?
Yeah, challenging question.
Hi. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome again to the Lake38 Ventures podcast. It is a pleasure to have you here listening to us, and I appreciate all the feedback that you're giving as we, have started and continue to develop this platform. As a reminder, this platform is dedicated to thoughtful conversation at the intersection of sports, media, and capital. We are not looking to focus on headlines, individual transactions, anything in particular. Rather, the goal of the conversations is to explore the structural forces shaping the industry and this, exciting space of sports, media, entertainment that continues to grow and see a lot of new activities, new investors, new opportunities coming up. So the goal is simple: it is clarity over noise, perspective over speculation. And today, as I was mentioning, I'm very pleased to be joined by Hadrien Perazzini. Hadrien has built a career across multiple layers of the sports, capital, media ecosystem. He has experience with football clubs like Arsenal, agency environments like IMG, as well as having worked with the NBA in both European context, but also in Asia. And so it's a pleasure to hear from him about how some of the themes that are very much at the core front and mind of lots of investors these days can shape some of the conversations for other operator investors and executives. So thank you, Hadrien, for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Massimo, and I very much so look forward to the conversation.
Great. So, Hadrien, you've operated across Arsenal, IMG, and the NBA, various advisory roles. When you compare those environments, both in Europe and Asia, what fundamentally differentiates, let's say, the European football ecosystem from the US league model?
I think there's one thing that is probably true across the board, right? I think the sports industry first, as a global industry, is an incredible source of stories and emotions. And at the same time, it's a completely untraditional business, I would say. And this is true across the board. We have stories every day written, whether it's the Winter Olympics, whether it's US leagues, whether it's, football in Africa and South America. You have stories and that are quite unique and quite valuable written and provided to us every single day. And that there's no other industry that is able to put 80,000 people in an arena and looking at 22 actors actually playing an unscripted scenario live in front of you. So that's quite unique and quite valuable. And I think we have to remember that also from what the future holds when it comes to technology and the evolution with AI. I think I was quite, just because you touched on the career, I consider myself extremely fortunate to be able to have seen those different ecosystems from different sides of the tables, right? So top tier rights holders, smaller ecosystems. I did spend 3 years with Atalanta, which today is the poster child probably of how to run a football club in Europe. But it was 20 years ago, it was a very different entity. As you mentioned, rights holder agencies, US rights holders, European rights holder, looking at, the rights holder business from a team perspective and league perspective is very different. And obviously the way business are run in Europe and the US and in Asia are are different, and we can touch on that. I think that, again, in terms of what is true across the board, is I feel that the sports industry is ultimately an aggregation of very complex and entrenched ecosystems. And what you need to be able to do is actually understand all the nuances of any of those ecosystems that you're diving into, whether it's as an operator, as an investor, ultimately even as an employee and a fan. And so I think that, when you look at the differences between, let's say, Europe and US leagues, I think there is obviously, this is a question I obviously have discussed with you before, and it's something that I get a lot. I think that there is obviously pros and cons in every business model. And I think the European model has that meritocratic angle, which is quite dear to, I think, our heart here in Europe, which ultimately comes with financial volatility, right? So you have the advantage of that promotion, relegation, an open competition. Any club can kind of rise dramatically, which ultimately fuels the storytelling, because usually at the end of the season, the entire table has some storytelling, whether it's promotion, relegation, chasing for the title, chasing for European competition. And I think the other interesting thing is obviously that pyramid that we have in the European model, where ultimately you, as a 6-year-old kid, when you start playing football or basketball or volleyball, you ultimately kind of start at the bottom of this pyramid in the grassroots movement, but ultimately it's the same pyramid that leads to the top performance in our sport. The disadvantage is obviously the difference to the US is that there's that piece of promotion and relegation, which fuels the storytelling, and the governance that we ultimately have here in Europe creates sometimes a problem of alignment of the different stakeholders, and maybe puts a little bit of the brakes on economical growth from the sports industry. And ultimately, over the latest years, it has also kind of widened the gap between the richer and poorer clubs. And that kind of lack of stability is obviously a big question mark for a lot of the stakeholders here in Europe. When you look at the US model, I guess stability is the one thing that clearly differs with the US, and everyone knows that. The close franchises, the salary caps, but especially the revenue distribution model basically means that all boats are rising together at the same time, which is incredibly valuable when you look at this from especially an ownership and an investor perspective. You could say that probably some of the disadvantages in some leagues, I guess, is the number of regular season games being played. So if they want to win the league, they have to win every single game till the end of the season if they want to make sure that they win a game. Whether they play Chelsea, whether they play the bottom team of the table, it doesn't matter. In the US, you probably have that feeling a little bit that some of the regular season games lack of that competitive edge, which I think is a topic in terms of how does that affect, the engagement and ultimately the revenues linked to those games. And I think maybe the other side effect from the US model is that ultimately the main focus is obviously profitability and the growth of valuations of those assets. And the risk is to lean into an over commercialization, which could ultimately mean that fans feel a little bit disconnected or feel squeezed. I think you have some examples where the media and content offering is sliced and diced, and fans need to ultimately subscribe to 7 different platforms to follow the games. And I think that there's a limit of how much you can push in that sense.
Thank you for sharing such a thoughtful and detailed view. One of the things obviously that we have seen over the last few years has been a massive influx of investment, right, in European football in particular, and mostly, a lot of it is coming out of the US. Given also some of the topics you were discussing just now, do you think that has also impacted the way clubs behave, and does that change the way you look at, opportunities when you talk to, potential investors?
Yeah, I think Obviously, yeah, you have been at the center of that as well, Massimo. I think we've seen obviously over the last 15 years a completely different amount and different type of capital being deployed into sports, generally speaking, with different intention. I think what we need to remember is that not every type of investor has the same objectives. And I think in some cases you and I work with investors. I think in some cases it's not completely straightforward to actually understand and read between the lines to understand what their primary objectives are. But fundamentally, a sovereign fund will have completely different objectives than a private equity fund or a high net worth individual. So different objectives, but also different timelines when it comes to be invested. I think what has probably changed is that ownership groups are looking more and more at clubs, if we're talking about clubs or franchises, portfolio assets rather than clubs. And this obviously comes again with some positive effects and some challenges. So I think that when you speak about the side of, for example, the relationship with intermediaries that ownership groups and club have, I think that this is a constant evolving ecosystem. It's, you need to have a clear strategy and be able to play that balancing act. And the fact that ownership groups have looked at this more as a portfolio asset rather than a club means also that ownership groups might have become a little bit less operationally engaged, which ultimately translate into freedom and opportunities for intermediaries to become more and more powerful. And today you have, 2 or 3, 4 big groups that are ultimately representing most of the players. So that's something that probably has kind of changed a little bit when you compare that to 20 years ago. I think clubs have become more and more eager to set up their own in-house recruitment, data collection point, try to stay in the driving seats. And they also have been moving into that kind of more platform approach rather than just teams. So I think the difference that you've noticed is really the approach and the objectives and how closely or remotely, depending on the type of investors, ownership groups are to the day-to-day. I think one take for me is I think we have professionalized the expectations. We haven't yet professionalized always the execution. I think there's still a big gap there. I don't know what your opinion is on that, but as I said, there's been yes, we're looking at clubs as portfolio assets. Yes, we're looking at clubs as a platform. And we understand that, there's not just a team, there's commercial, there is data, but ultimately we haven't necessarily seen this translating into exponential growth that we might have expected. But so I think that's positive. There has been a change, a shift in terms of the type of investors that have come into the industry, but there's still a huge upside when it comes to translating this into a better execution.
Yeah, no, I think, you and I discussed this as well in the past, right? I guess the main issue from what I see is that ultimately, particularly in the European model, with so much focus onto performance on the pitch for obvious reasons, not being regulated or being promoted, etc. All the capital tends to go often onto, squad value. And obviously that sometimes might impact the ability to develop, whether it's the business side, whether it's, improve some of the externalities around stadiums, but, there is too much focus perhaps sometimes on the pitch, which is where some of the topics I think you were discussing are obviously relevant. But I also want to, take some of the points you were making around intermediaries, how important it is to have, let's say a coherent academy recruitment strategy. And obviously, neither of us are professional football experts, but by any means, I think we can also say that conceptually, I think successful clubs need to also focus on player trading as a way to either allocate capital successfully, but also perhaps, obtain some sort of financial results. Do you think that sometimes, clubs can underestimate the importance of having a coherent model around talent investment? And in terms of your experience and your discussions, how do you think investors are approaching this topic?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting point, Massimo. And I feel that I think everyone nowadays is aware how important that part is. Because ultimately, you could probably count on a hand how many clubs are profitable before the revenues of player sales. So I think that everyone understands that. I think this is critical. I think what probably investors underestimate is how do you then actually oversee that part of the business and how you translate the importance of this into a long-standing strategy. I think the critical part here is, and again, as you mentioned, I mean, this is not my area. I haven't really worked on the sporting side of things, and I don't pretend to know that part of the business particularly well, but it's obviously an important part of the P&L and the balance sheet in the case of European football. I think that what I've seen is that there's usually a lack of clarity in terms of what the strategy is. And yes, it's an evolving ecosystem because financial fair play rules can change, the relationship with certain agents can change. There's a consolidation happening actually in the agency world at the moment. So all these things make this ecosystem kind of fluid and mobile. But fundamentally, you need as a club to have a strategy on the sporting side. And you have to understand what the strategy is in the long term, what your budget is. And fundamentally, I think the key thing here is taking the emotions out of the equation. I've been working with a partner of mine that has expertise in that field for many years on an acquisition of a European club. And I think, the approach has always been, on the player side of things, it's going to be very clear how many players every year of the squad are going to be coming from the academy, how many are, experienced players, and how many players are going to come in to the team from outside, and how many are gonna leave. And I think if you can have that strategy and really take the emotions out of the equation and avoid getting into, oh, maybe I could just spend that additional 10, 50, 100 million this year because it's going to help me get that promotion, get that European qualification. That's where, unfortunately, these can be very expensive mistakes. And the business side of things can do everything well and increase revenue from commercial ticketing and be the best at engaging their fan base, but those can be very costly mistakes. And I think, coming back to the initial part of your question, I think a lot of investors that have an expertise in field maybe underestimate how complex that part of the business is, and how much still today, outside of the data analytics, it's a relationship business.
That's very true, I think. And also particularly, when it's so easy to forget that, if you buy the wrong, or, you're not able to develop the right striker for whatever reason, maybe because it doesn't fit with the way that the manager wants to play. And suddenly, you may be sitting on a significant loss. Totally see what you're saying. But let's swap focus perhaps a little bit. One of the key topic of conversations over the last few weeks and months even has been, the NBA, right? There has been so much talk about the NBA, the new European league that the NBA is going to launch. Now it's been announced. So, to step back first a little bit, the NBA is one of the leagues that, together with other professional sports league in the US, has been able to centralize governance, revenue sharing, salary structure. Do you think, those sort of centralization, those sort of rules make a league more investable? And second, what do you think football can realistically, borrow from this model of, the NBA model?
Yeah, so lots of topics to cover here, Massimo. I think let's maybe take a quick step back and look maybe at the NBA model that it is today. I think as you mentioned, the fundamental is the model with a strong commissioner level governance that ultimately means the product, the IP is protected and decisions are made for the long-term health of the business. And going back to the differences with Europe, I think, when you are at an assembly of a league, whether it's the Premier League or Serie A or La Liga, you have ownership groups that have completely different objectives, right? If you are, a top club, you're thinking, how can I increase my revenue and stay competitive against the top other 10, 15 clubs in Europe? If you are a bottom table club, you're thinking, my priority is to win the next 3 games and make sure that I don't get relegated. So completely different timeframes, completely different objectives. With the model of the NBA, that obviously disappears. Every stakeholder has a pretty good alignment on the objectives. Different owners might not always have the same opinion on how to get from A to B, and the commissioner might have a different opinion. And that's healthy debate, but fundamentally the objectives of every stakeholder is growing the revenue, the profitability, and ultimately the valuation of the business. And so having that structure where there's a financial discipline and that, sophisticated commercial model that is ultimately redistributing the revenues in a certain ways is fundamental. I think the other aspect that maybe are a little bit less known is that I think the NBA, compared to probably European leagues, is very good at looking after their stakeholders. So whether it's the players, the coaches, the entertainment teams, the employees, the legends, there's a huge amount of people that on a daily basis work, supporting these stakeholders. The NBA has that pretty famous department called Teambo, which is the team marketing business operation. And that group of people fundamentally spend all their days supporting the franchises on a various number of topics and making sure that the franchises get the support they need from the league's office. They operate in a better way. They become more profitable. They help them invest in the right areas, whether it's stadium, whether it's technology, work on a fan engagement. So I think that kind of very broad ecosystem is completely unique. Just like, I guess, the international footprint that the NBA has is quite unique. David Stern, who probably is one of the most influential executive that the sports industry has seen, understood about 30 years ago that, well, it's great that our NBA games are on CCTV in China, but if we want to create a long-lasting business in China, we're going to need boots on the ground. We're going to need people that focus day in, day out on this business, understand the Chinese environment, and build a relationship with key stakeholders there. And so when I was at the NBA, I think it's probably still the case, but we had 180 people employed by the NBA based in China, between the offices in Shanghai, Beijing, and Hong Kong. There's no other rights holder that has 14 offices around the world and has that kind of footprint. And that translates into ultimately interesting returns today after having that approach for so long. So I think that I just wanted to put that in place. When it comes to NBA Europe, which you're right, is a pretty hot topic. And, I find it actually fascinating because I've been for the last 12 months talking to, private and institutional investors, to my ex-colleagues at the NBA, to a few ex-NBA players, to some of the clubs here in Europe. And I think what's very interesting is to see the complete different mindsets between the two sides of the Atlantic. I was in New York in November and hearing how excited people were about this opportunity was fascinating. Well, I think in Europe, we were obviously more concerned about the disruptive approach.
No?
Yes, exactly. And we struggle a little bit to get out of that kind of traditional way of operating a league. And again, I don't want to judge who's right, who's not. I think there's some truth on both sides of the ponds. But I think fundamentally, I think the key element of NBA Europe is, I think it will grow the pie of European basketball. I think the NBA has the strength to grow basketball in Europe. And actually, that brings me back a little bit to, coming back to the point of sometimes we struggle to see opportunities. Well, when I joined the NBA, that's in 2011, we were rolling out a full program of events in Europe, right? NBA regular season games, NBA preseason games, NBA 3-on-3 tours, other grassroots events, clinics, etc. And in some countries in Europe, we were seeing that the national federations were seeing this as a threat to their business. They're like, well, this is my garden. Why are you coming and running your events here? And after a while, actually, federations understood that this benefits them as well, because ultimately that grows the enthusiasm around basketball. And if a 6-year-old kid wants to start playing basketball, that kid is ultimately going to go in that grassroots and that pyramid that is run by the national federation. So that's why I ultimately think that the NBA has the power and the strength to grow basketball in Europe and create a more unified approach, right? The model is going to allow people to have a more long-term approach. And that's going to obviously feel quite appealing for sophisticated investors. So I think it's really going to be about, bringing that NBA business model, respecting some of the traditional and cultural sensitivities. I think it can be incredibly powerful for investors. It's going to come with, hurdles. I mean, I know a little bit how certain basketball clubs operate in Europe, but even football clubs. And I know how the NBA operates. And those are two completely different worlds, right? There's going to be a period of transition where even successful basketball clubs in Europe are going to have to understand and embrace that new approach and that new way of operating. It's going to be a very interesting and exciting opportunity for the basketball landscape.
Very enough. Thank you for sharing your perspective and also for some of this insight about the working of the NBA. I wasn't aware about that team. What do you say? Timbo?
Timbo.
Timbo. Yes, that's very interesting. I mean, certainly something that with the right budgets, let's say, I'm sure would be useful for other sports. You were also talking about sophisticated investors. So, if you think about the sophisticated capital that's entered the sports world, how do you think they should be looking at investing in sports? As infrastructure, as a platform play, as a trophy asset? What do you think is the key for a sophisticated capital to get comfortable in investing in sports?
I think ultimately it comes down to what we said before. Everyone has different objectives, but I think fundamentally everyone should look at sports as an investment and understand that the sport is not a standard business, right? It's not a passive business. It's not a liquid business. And you have to be ready to embrace that. I think my advice is to investors is always look at the wider ecosystem and make sure you understand that, first of all, teams are unique ecosystems, right? Running an NBA franchise is very different than running a football club. But then running a football club in the Premier League is going to be different than running a club in Serie A. But even if you're in the Premier League, running Arsenal and running Sunderland is two different businesses. So ultimately, every club, every team has specificities and nuances that you need to take into account. And then that's the team. But then I think I always encourage people to make sure you do as much due diligence as possible, not just on the asset or the business, but on the environment you're investing in, right? Mm-hmm. Understand the governance, but the unwritten governance, which we know exists significantly in football, and understand the regulatory risks, understand how the wider economy works, understand the city and the community you're investing in. I think that's fundamental. I think there needs to be a long-term value creation approach. Quick flips don't work. And I would say, coming with that, avoid paying passion premium unless you really don't care at all about what the kind of return, and you don't care about the financials. I've been, this, Massimo, I've been lately in working with a consortium in a motorsport acquisition, and ultimately we felt that we were not ready to pay a premium for just the fact that be part of this and stick to the financials, and ultimately didn't move forward with the transaction that we were contemplating. And I think that that's fundamental. And I think when you know all of this, I think ultimately investors, what I would say is the successful ones are the ones that come with an operational thesis, not just a financial one. So ultimately, to make this work, you need strong, reliable, and well-funded capital partnering with operating expertise to make sure that you're going to be able to understand really well what you're investing in before, but also a kind of post-deal value creation mindset in place from the start, and really understand how this translates into your 5, 7, 10 years business plan. I think that's the oversight. You were mentioning infrastructure and media rights and platform economics, which are a lot of the hot topics as well. I think infrastructure is a really interesting one, and I think that's obviously an area where probably in the US rights holders are a little bit further ahead than ourselves here in Europe. It's a significant value driver. I think we slowly understand also in European football, but not just football, there are basketball teams that have ambitions of building their own arena, building a hub that lives 365 days a year outside of match days. And I think that's incredibly valuable. That's incredibly important. I think we need to see a slight shift from certain stakeholders, especially authorities in certain markets. I'm sure you're well aware, Massimo, the situation that you have in Rome, where you have an iconic stadium like Stadio Flaminio, which is in the very center part of one of the most iconic cities in the world. And the stadium can't be, for a lot of different reasons that we don't have time to explore today, can't become the stadium of one of the two top football clubs in the city. So I think that requires a shift of, all stakeholders. And again, from an investment perspective, I think you need probably traditional investors need to partner with investors that have expertise in the infrastructure side of things, as well as, operators that understand what it means to build and especially operate a stadium or an arena 365 days a year. But that's an incredible pocket of growth for certain businesses in our industry.
Well, Adrian, I guess I want to close with one final question, which is more of a longer term question. Let's say we fast forward 10 years. What structural change you think would have reshaped the sport investment landscape the most? What is going to be the theme, the trend, the change that we will look at and say, this is what really made a difference over the past 10 years?
Yeah, challenging question, Massimo, right? Because we have geopolitical, situations that evolve on a daily basis nowadays. We have, it seems, from a technology perspective, AI that is, revolutionizing what we do and how things will look like on a weekly basis. I think, over the next decade, I think obviously the media distribution, content distribution will be in a very, very different place. I think we will see how, the combination of streaming platforms, but especially direct to consumers, will probably dominate the landscape. Whereas I think, one of the biggest value, we touched a little bit on it, is the platforms for teams and clubs and leagues to own the data, have that direct relationships with their fans. And I think the direct to consumer will ultimately evolve in a real direct to consumer proposition where, today, I think kudos to the French league, which went down that route, not necessarily by choice, but went to launch their D2C proposition, but ultimately it's distributed by, I think, 6 or 7 platforms. So they don't necessarily have a direct relationship with all of the fans. But I think that's going to be obviously it's going to shift and lean more and more towards a direct relationship between the content creators and the consumers of their content. How that translates into revenue and how this will be monetized, I guess, is the big question mark. I think there will be, a tech integration. I think the interesting part is that if you think about AI, if you think about today, you can create a movie, a 90-minute movie with AI with famous actors. That industry is probably going to get disrupted much more than the live content, because that will probably, from my perspective, survive. Again, what kind of live content? Is it going to be the traditional 90-minute football game? Is it going to be the Kings League? That's kind of obviously a wider discussion, but I think live content will survive the next 10 years, and it will be enhanced by technology. So, for example, I'm currently working with a volumetric and augmented reality content capturing a company, and I think the technology that kind of technology will just enhance the way fans are consuming content, and that's, I think, a natural evolution. The third point probably is, I think, and again, we could probably talk about this for a couple of hours, is the power of athletes, right? I mean,
Yeah.
ultimately, athletes are the ones delivering the show, delivering the product. They're the ones creating the storytelling. So I could see a shift in terms of the power that athletes will have when it comes to the decision making, the product definition, and maybe reshape a little bit some of the governance, the traditional governance that we see in sports. So those are probably a few topics that are probably going to come with us over the next 10 years.
Great. Well, Hadrien, thank you very much for your time. This has been extremely thoughtful and strategic. Exactly what I knew we were going to explore with your experience and know-how. So thank you very much for taking the time once again, and thank you to everyone for listening.
It's been a pleasure, Massimo, and we'll keep the conversation going next time I see you in London.
Absolutely. See you soon. Thank you.
Have a good one. Take care. Bye-bye.
And you. Bye.